Hello, everybody. My name is Will Martin. I'm an attorney for the North Carolina Realtors. It's July 11th, and we all know what that means. 11 days ago, the North Carolina Realtors rolled out changes to its many residential, commercial, property management, and this year auction forms have undergone some changes. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes highlighting just 10 of what I consider to be the most significant changes to the residential forms. 5 of those changes are in the offer to purchase and contract, and 5 other forms each account for one of the other 5 changes I'm going to touch on. Before I do that, though, I want to identify several new property management and commercial forms. There are 4 new property management forms. So the PMD was very busy this spring updating the rental contract and the property management agreement, but also developing these 4 new forms. I just want to briefly mention them. The first one is a new ground lease designed for the lease of a parcel or space. That's Form 414-T. It's patterned very closely after the existing residential rental contract, with things that don't pertain to the lease of a dwelling just taken out. So it's a little bit shorter, but it looks an awful lot like the rental contract. We think this form will be used mostly, excuse me, by members who manage mobile home parks, but it could also be used for somebody who's managing an individual parcel, maybe with a mobile home on it, or maybe something else. There's also a new form that can be used in the very common situation we get questions about, where the tenant wants to terminate their lease before its ending date. That's 426-T, and it will enable the property manager to enter into an agreement with the tenant about the terms and conditions of the early termination of the lease. The third new property management form is a demand for possession form, which we created in response to a number of reports of the dismissal of eviction cases based on the fact that the property manager was unable to prove that they had demanded possession before they filed the eviction, and demanding possession is a statutory requirement. So this new form may be used to either terminate the lease and demand possession of the property, or simply to demand possession of the property from a holdover tenant. That's Form 427-T. The fourth new property management form is a sight unseen addendum that can be added to the rental contract in situations where the tenant has rented a property that they haven't physically seen yet. That's Form 446-T. Okay, the 2 new commercial forms. The first is a guarantee addendum that can be added to either of the NCR's commercial lease forms or an attorney drafted lease if the landlord is going to require a third party to guarantee the tenant's obligations under the lease. That's Form 595-T. The second new commercial form is a memorandum of lease that can be filed in the Register of Deeds office in situations where the lease is for more than 3 years. That's Form 596-T. Okay, that's a very quick look at 6 new property management and commercial forms. I'm going to move on now to a quick look at several changes to the residential forms. And you will see the paragraphs that I'm referring to on the screen as I go through each of them. I think there's also a link to the document that's now on the screen in the chat feature. Change number 1, fuel tanks and fuel. Those of you who've been in the business for a while will remember that back in the day, you had to measure the amount of fuel left in the tank at closing, and the seller was given credit for what was left on the settlement statement. So essentially the buyer was purchasing the unused fuel from the seller. That caused a lot of issues when brokers either forgot to do the measurement, or the closing date got changed and it had been measured, but nobody remeasured it, and that caused arguments Plus, it was a pain to do the measurement anyway. So we changed the offer to purchase quite a few years ago now, so that the buyer now essentially gets what's left in the tank as of settlement as part of the purchase price. So they're not paying the seller for the fuel that remains in the tank at settlement. That change did reduce the number of disputes about fuel, but we continue to get occasional disputes about fuel and fuel tank ownership. So the Forms Committee thought it might be helpful to create a new section in the offer to purchase that's devoted exclusively to fuel tanks and fuel. So wording pertaining to fuel tanks and fuel that appeared in different sections of the previous version of the offer to purchase have been consolidated into a new paragraph 7D, which is in the seller representations section of the offer to purchase. So you won't find any reference to fuel tanks and fuel in the list of fixtures in that list in paragraph 2. It's all been moved into this new paragraph 7D. Most of the wording has remained the same, but there are a couple of changes that I want you to know about. First, in the new version of the offer to purchase, the seller will be required to identify whether there are any fuel tanks located on the property, and if there are any, to provide information about them. Sellers are already required to provide this information when they list their property using the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. So we've essentially taken those blanks from the seller representation section of the listing agreement and copied and pasted them into this new paragraph 7D in the offer to purchase. So the information about the tank, whether it's owned or leased, and contact information for the owner of the tank if it's leased, and the fuel provider, that information will now need to be completed in the offer to purchase as well. One of the issues that has occasionally come up is where the tank is leased, but it's not identified as a leased item in paragraph 2 of the offer to purchase. And so that sometimes causes the buyer to argue that the seller's in breach of contract if the seller isn't able to convey ownership of the tank as part of the sale. So it's a practice trap when the agents neglect to identify it as a leased tank. So in the new version, assuming the seller identifies the tank as leased in paragraph 7D by checking the appropriate box, there will be no need to list it as a leased item in paragraph 2 that would be excluded from the transaction. So if the seller provides the information about the tank in the offer to purchase, it will avoid this practice trap that agents occasionally fell into. We anticipate that MLSs will create new fields for this information if they don't already exist, so that the information will be readily available to a buyer's agent when they're preparing an offer. In the meantime, we recommend that if a listing includes a fuel tank, the listing agent should add information about the tank in the agent's remarks section so that it will help the buyer agent who's trying to prepare an offer properly complete the offer. The second thing I want to mention, and this is really important about this new paragraph, is that in the new version of the offer to purchase, the seller may use any fuel in a tank through settlement, but the seller is not permitted to remove the fuel or resell it. This is a change from the previous version of the offer to purchase. And what that means to me is that if there's a significant amount of fuel in a tank at the time of an offer, the seller really should take that into consideration in determining an acceptable sales price, because they're not really going to be permitted to resell it to the provider. Okay, change number 2. I think this is a significant change. Paragraph 11 in the offer to purchase is the paragraph that deals with what happens if there's a material change in the condition of the property after contract and before closing. As you know, this paragraph's been in the offer to purchase for many years. If there's a material change in the condition of the property, and I had a hotline call this morning where just before closing, a tree fell into the side of the house. So in that situation, if the seller is unable or unwilling to return the property to the condition it was in on the date of the offer by closing, then the buyer has a choice to make. The buyer can either terminate the contract, or the buyer can proceed with the transaction, accepting the property in its existing condition, and would be entitled to the proceeds of any insurance policy on any claim that the seller files. If the buyer decides to terminate, in the previous version of the contract, the buyer was entitled to a refund of their earnest money, but not their due diligence money. That's been changed, significant change. This has never been an issue until the due diligence fees have gotten to where they are, but it just didn't seem fair that if the seller failed for whatever reason to return the property to its current condition, and the buyer just didn't want to go through with the transaction, that the buyer was essentially forfeiting their due diligence fee. So going forward, the buyer will be entitled to a refund of their due diligence fee. And we had a lot of discussion about this. And the buyer is not entitled to recover their due diligence costs, which would be the case if the seller was in breach of contract. This is not really a breach of contract, because the seller is not contractually obligated to maintain the property in the same condition it's in as on the date of the offer. It's just that the buyer has the right to terminate the contract if the condition of the property changes in some material way and the seller doesn't restore it to its previous condition. We hope this change will more fairly balance the parties' rights and duties in a difficult situation where the condition of the property has unexpectedly changed after contract, but before closing, and it may not be feasible to return the property to its previous condition. Change number 3. Payment of owner association and management company fees. Misunderstandings about whether the buyer or the seller is responsible for payment of a particular fee that's being charged by an owners association or its management company are pretty common. In the previous version of the contract, the party's obligations to pay those fees are addressed in different sections of the contract, and they cross-reference each other. So in order to figure out whether or not the buyer or the seller is responsible for payment of a particular fee, sometimes you had to sort of toggle back and forth between different sections of the contract. So we hope and believe that trying to address the parties' obligations in the same paragraph of the contract will help reduce confusion about which party is responsible for a particular fee. So the parties' responsibilities for payment of owner association fees are now addressed in a new charges by owners association paragraph, which is paragraph 9. Now, the buyer and the seller obligations are not fundamentally different in the new version, but I do want to point out 2 things. In the new version, the seller is specifically responsible for payment of any fees charged for transferring or updating ownership records of the association, as well as for payment of any expedite fee charged for providing statements on owners association dues or assessments. I think in the previous version, the seller was responsible for those things, but now it's specifically stated. The second thing I want to mention is that in the old version, in the buyer's column, there was this phrase that the buyer is responsible for quote unquote charges for buyer's future use and enjoyment of the property. Well, we've taken that out. It's a fairly broad phrase, and it seemed like it sometimes caused disputes about whether or not a particular fee fell within the meaning of that phrase. And so in the new version, we just list specific types of charges that are the responsibility of the buyer to pay, rather than this sort of broad category with examples. We've just kind of taken the examples And as before, any charge that is not specifically in the buyer's column is the responsibility of the seller. That's not a change. Okay, fourth change. Still in the offer to purchase, paragraph 1C, mobile homes. In the new version, the parties will need to affirmatively indicate whether or not the sale will include a manufactured or mobile home. We made this change at the request of the real estate attorneys on the Joint Forms Task Force. They complained that on occasion, they won't know until the last second that the transaction actually includes a mobile home. And that's something they have to check out, and it can cause delays. And although we've got an addendum and the additional provisions addendum that can be attached to the contract to identify a mobile home that's going to be part of the transaction, apparently on a number of occasions that addendum is not attached. And so hopefully by specifically requiring the parties to indicate whether or not the transaction will include a mobile home, it will be identified as part of the transaction more often, and the closing attorneys won't have the issues that come up when they don't find out that the sale includes a mobile home until the 11th hour. All right, fifth change. This is the last change to the offer to purchase. The remedy of specific performance. This is in paragraph 23B. In the new version of the offer to purchase, the buyer's right to sue for specific performance is specifically stated in paragraph 23. I don't think this is a substantive change from the previous version of the contract, because in the previous version, all the buyer's remedies that are available to the buyer were preserved if the seller failed to perform the contract. So we do believe that specifically identifying the buyer's right to sue for specific performance will help highlight the existence of that remedy as an alternative to termination of the contract and recovery of damages. So those are the 5 changes I wanted to mention to the offer to purchase. I want to say that changes 2, 3, 4, and 5 have also been made to the vacant lot/land version of the offer to purchase, which is Form 12T. And the 3rd and 5th changes that I just summarized have been made to the new construction version of the offer to purchase and contract. That's Form 800T. Okay, moving on to the remaining 5 changes. Change number 6 is to the buyer possession before closing agreement, which is Form 2A7-T. We've added some new wording to clarify 3 things. 1, the seller must deliver all means of access to the property to the buyer at the commencement of the buyer's possession. 2, the seller is entitled to retain an entry key. 3, the seller has a right of access to the property, but only in the case of an emergency. The previous version of that form did not address the issue of access to the property, and so our view was in the buyer possession before closing agreement, since the seller didn't retain any right to possession, they didn't have any right to possession. So we've at least clarified that. Change number 7, this is to the seller possession after closing agreement, and we've added some comparable wording in paragraph 1 to clarify the same 3 things. 1, the seller must provide the buyer with an entry key at closing. 2, the seller is entitled to retain all means of access to the property during the seller's term of occupancy. And 3, the buyer has a right of access to the property during the seller's possession, but only in the case of an emergency. All right, change number 8. This is to the offer to purchase and contract for vacant lots/land. I've just mentioned that 4 of the 5 changes that I went over on Form 2T have also been made to Form 12T. We've also made some changes to the note at the very top of page 1, right under the name of the form. and this note's been in this form for many years. The main purpose of the note is to give a heads up to users about the existence of a North Carolina statute, excuse me, that limits the ability of a seller to sell property by reference to a subdivision plat that hasn't received final approval and been recorded. Well, the note in the previous version of Form 12T was a little overbroad the way it was written, and it sometimes caused confusion about whether Form 12T would be an appropriate form to use in a particular transaction. So the purpose of the revisions to the note is to more carefully describe the limitations imposed by the statute and to specifically cite the statute. And I would say that if you're in a close call about whether or not this statute applies, you probably ought to be talking with a lawyer about whether or not 12T is an appropriate form to use. And the note hopefully will help point the lawyer to the statute to look at to determine whether or not it applies to the particular transaction that you want to put under contract. Okay, change number 9 is to the referral agreement. That's Form 730. We got a few questions last year. Well, let me put it this way. If you refer a prospect to somebody else in exchange for the payment of a referral fee, and you find out that the prospect has been assigned to somebody else other than the person that you referred them to, is that okay? We had several questions about that during this past year. And so the Forms Committee decided to add a new assignment paragraph to the referral agreement. And the effect of that new paragraph, it will prohibit assignment of a referral agreement by the firm receiving the referral, and it will prohibit a change in the individual agent to whom the referral was made without the written consent of the firm that made the referral. We've also specifically stated that if an assignment is permitted, the assignee will be bound by all the terms of the referral agreement. Okay, change number 10, last but certainly not least, change to the dual agency wording in the listing agreement. And I'll say that I'm using the listing agreement to highlight this change, but the dual agency wording also appears in all the other listing agreements and buyer agency agreements, both residential and commercial. And this same change has been made to all of those agency agreements. But I'm gonna use the listing agreement to illustrate the change that's been made. In the previous version of the listing agreement, the formatting of the dual agency paragraph sometimes caused confusion about whether the seller needed to authorize both dual agency and designated a dual agency because they were in separate subparagraphs. In the new version, the authorization to practice designated dual agency, if it's offered by the firm, you don't have to offer designated dual agency, but if you do, and if the seller authorizes it, the authorization appears as a subset of dual agency. That's because a seller has to first authorize dual agency in order for the firm to also be in a position to practice designated dual agency. So we hope that the reformatting of this section will clarify the need for the seller to authorize both dual agency and designated dual agency by initialing in both places. Several things that I want to bring specifically to your attention about this new paragraph. It's important, very important to note that in the new version, if the seller initials the designated dual agency choice, the seller is not only authorizing the firm to practice designated dual agency, the firm is directing the firm to practice designated dual agency. We made this change at the request of the Real Estate Commission. One of their attorneys, Charlie Moody, sits on the Forms Committee, and Charlie told the Forms Committee that the commission has received a number of complaints from sellers, or it could be buyers, involving firms that ended up practicing dual agency, notwithstanding the fact that the client had authorized designated dual agency, and the client was upset that the firm had chosen to practice dual agency rather than having an agent who represented only their interests. And so we've strengthened the wording so that now the seller is both authorizing and directing the firm to practice designated dual agency. I want to point out a couple of things about this new paragraph that are new, a couple of other things that's new, two more things. First, if a seller authorizes dual agency, the new version of the form requires the seller to indicate whether the same individual agent will be permitted to represent both the seller and the buyer in a transaction. Apparently, sometimes the seller is okay with dual agency, but they really don't want the same agent representing the buyer as well. And this will give you the ability to clearly indicate that in the listing agreement. Secondly, if the firm offers designated dual agency and the seller authorizes it, the firm may remain in dual agency only if designated agency would not be permitted for some reason, or if the seller agrees in writing that the firm will remain in dual agency only. I'll give you an example. Let's assume that a firm practices designated dual agency and a seller client authorizes. Also assume that the listing agent also represents a buyer who has authorized designated dual agency and who wants to look at the seller's property. Well, the same individual agent obviously can't represent both the buyer and the seller as a designated dual agent. And in that case, the individual agent would need to get something in writing at that time from both the seller and the buyer, authorizing the individual agent to represent them both in a transaction involving the seller's property. In my view, a simple email exchange with the client or clients would suffice. On the other hand, if the buyer and seller still want designated dual agency, the firm will need to designate one agent to represent only the interests of the seller and a different agent to represent only the interests of the buyer. The important point here is that if a seller or a buyer has indicated a desire for an agent who will represent only their interests, that's what you need to do, unless, this is assuming you offer designated dual agency, unless the seller or the buyer changes their mind and lets you know they consent to that in writing, or designated agency can't be practiced for some reason. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, that same change has also been made to all the other residential and commercial agency agreements. That is the end of my script. I'm going to check here in a second to see if any questions have come in. I'll try to answer a few of them now. If I can't get to all of them, we're going to try to handle them on the legal hotline. Speaking of which, if you have questions later, please call us or contact us on the hotline. The phone number is 336-294-1415. And the email address is legalhotline@ncrealtors.org. Legalhotline@ncrealtors.org. There are also much more detailed summaries of all the changes to all of the residential, commercial, property management, and auction forms available on the NC Realtors website at ncrealtors.org. If you check in, if you sign in, there's a quick link at the top. Click on the Q&A quick link, and you'll find summaries under the forms category. I hope this has been helpful. Let me see what questions we've got. It looks like we've got a couple here. First one, if there is a dispute over whether the property is in the same or better condition, will they need to go to court to recover any due diligence? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes. You know, as in any dispute about the contract, if the parties are unable to work it out at the end of the day, a man or a woman in a black robe is going to have to decide what the parties' obligations are under the contract. So unfortunately, yes, that's true. Second question, what about teams? If two different agents on a team are representing buyer and seller, but we've been directed that designated dual agency is not allowed on a team, since all listings are put in MLS under the team lead. Oh, wow, you're going to blow my mind here with the team question. You know, that's a good question. My knee-jerk reaction would be, you know, if you've got people on a team, just almost the concept of team to me indicates that you are collaborating in the representation of this client. And, you know, one of the prerequisites to be designated as an agent for somebody is that, you know, you can't have confidential information about the other party. And given the collaborative nature of teams, I wonder if that's practically possible. So be happy to discuss that with the person who posed this great question later in more detail, but my knee-jerk reaction is I think it's going to be difficult for two members on a team to be designated agents for the buyer and the seller. I mean, I think that question would exist regardless of any changes we've made to the listing agreement or the agency agreements. Good question, though. Okay, a couple more have come in here. I'll try to handle these two, and then in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and cut it off. Question, builders are still making it the buyer's responsibility of paying the transfer fee for the HOA. So I guess this will stand and the sellers will pay it in a resale transaction. Yes. If it's a fee for, what was the wording I used? Transferring the, let's see. Any fees charged for transferring or updating ownership records of the association, that's the seller's responsibility. You know, the term transfer fee is perhaps susceptible to different interpretations. And at the end of the day, regardless of what you call the fee, you really need to understand what the fee is really for in order to be able to properly determine whether or not it's the buyer's or the seller's responsibility. But yes, I think that's the seller's responsibility. I think that was true under the previous version of the offer to purchase, but we've now tried to make that clearer. Last question. What is the proper way to receive and sign for additional due diligence money since it is not represented on receipt of monies on page 16 of the offer to purchase? Okay. I happen to have a copy of the offer to purchase here. I thought we had, we don't address, yeah, I mean, there's the last, on the acknowledgement of receipt of money section, there is an acknowledgement for the escrow agent who is in receipt of additional earnest money. Oh, additional due diligence money. I'm sorry. Well, yeah, I mean, the contract doesn't really contemplate the payment of additional due diligence money. That's certainly something the parties could agree on, and an attorney, in my view, would need to draft some wording regarding the payment of an additional due diligence fee, because I just think that's definitely the practice of the law. And, you know, probably if you get, you would probably want to have a special acknowledgement of the receipt of additional due diligence fee that would be pretty much like the language in the acknowledgement of receipt of money sections we have now, so that the listing agent would acknowledge it if it's delivered to the listing agent, and the seller would acknowledge it if it's delivered directly to the seller. But we don't have a form for that because the basic contract doesn't contemplate the payment of an additional due diligence fee. Okay, well, I think that's it. Everybody, thanks a lot for taking the time to educate yourself about these changes. And I hope this has been helpful. Take care, and hope to talk to you again soon. All right, bye-bye.